Well, good morning, West Portal, and welcome to those of you hanging out with me here in person and the many of you who I know are connecting with us virtually. As you no doubt are aware, we have been taking a slow walk, if you will, through the last book of our Bibles, the book of Revelation. Somewhere near the end of the first century AD, our author, John, almost certainly one of Jesus' close friends and followers, experiences a series of powerful, graphic, unforgettable visions from Jesus about Jesus. And as we walk through this book, one of the things we've been saying is that the book of Revelation is a little bit more like a stroll through an art museum than it is turning the pages of a newspaper. We're given these vibrant pictures, and our tendency sometimes is to try to explain them almost away, to over-explain them. We do want to wrestle to understand them. Don't misunderstand me. But we need the image because it resonates, it imprints on us, it becomes memorable in a way that text doesn't. And we need to keep that in mind. And I'll park in a few places this morning to make that case. This is actually, we've come to kind of the middle chapters of the book. Chapter 12 last week, 13 this week, and 14 next week. It's a great spot where I just want to draw your attention again. There's two video overviews on the book of Revelation put together by the Bible Project. They're fabulously done. They're fairly short, 10 to 12 minutes apiece. It's a great way to keep the broad story arc of the book kind of in mind as we drill down into specific chapters kind of on a week-by-week basis. Our family rewatched them both last night. You can find the links under weekly resources on our website. It was sent out, I believe, as well with our weekly newsletter. We'll post them on some of our social media sites in the upcoming week. But again, a fabulous resource I encourage you to check out. I want to do just kind of a little bit of a flyover to catch us up to where we are today. One of the repeated invitations of the book of Revelation is for Jesus followers to overcome. Literally, it means to conquer. And one of the questions we should keep in mind is, what does it mean for you and for me to conquer? Because it's not a word that we use very often in everyday language, right? I don't walk out the door in the morning and say, "See you, honey. I'll be back in time for dinner. I'm off to conquer today," right? That'd be weird. And yet, there's an everyday reality that we're invited to process. So in chapter 5, we're introduced to the scroll of human history, the plan for God's kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven, for God to move history, and human history in particular, to its climax or to its conclusion. But nobody is found who's worthy to open this scroll and to move that plan forward until John hears of one who is. The Lion from the tribe of Judah, the root of David, he is able to do this. Now, these are classic Old Testament descriptions of a messianic king who would bring God's kingdom through military conquest. This is what the Jewish nation was expecting. John hears the Lion from the tribe of Judah, but he turns and he sees not an aggressive lion king, but he sees a lamb bloodied as if it had been slain. And this picture of Jesus as the lamb who was slain becomes really important for the way that we hear, read, and process this last book of our Bibles. In a surprising twist that nobody saw coming, God achieves a decisive victory through an apparent defeat. That the victory promised and anticipated in the Messiah begins not as Jesus comes and beats up all of his enemies, but as he hangs on a cross. And because of the resurrection, the death of Jesus is not a defeat. It is the way that he overcame, the way that he conquered sin, evil, and death. And we discover that the Lamb conquers through sacrificial love. And that gives us at least some clues as to what it might look like for you and for me as followers of the Lamb to conquer. It's going to involve an other-centered, sacrificial love, even of enemies. It will involve faithfulness to the Lamb in spite of suffering, persecution, or perhaps even worse. And this kind of brings us to 3 sets of 7 that John introduces us to. We're introduced to 7 seals and 7 trumpets and 7 bowls. Now, each of these portrays, it shows the kingdom of God coming, of God's justice pressing in, and each one kind of finishes with the coming of Jesus, or the day of the Lord, if you will. Now, some people believe that these are linear, that there's a sequential chronology happening here. The events of the seals are followed by the events of the trumpets, are followed by the events of the bowls. And some feel even that read this chronologically, that this is referring to events that have happened in the past. Some say this is events that are happening currently, and some will say, no, these are events that we're anticipating are going to take place at some point in the future. It's hard not to notice the way that John seems to have woven these 7s together. The bowls seem to come out of the trumpets, seem to come out of the seals. All 3 sets have matching conclusions. I remember as a young adult reading through the book of Revelation, and most of it's going like this, I'm just missing it, but a casual reading, and it's like, I've come to the end. And then the story starts again. That's weird. And then I come to the end, and the story picks up again. And I come to the end, and Revelation has a lot of end points in that regard. And therefore, you don't have to agree with me in this, but we feel it's more probable that John is portraying the same sequence of events from simply 3 different perspectives. He uses different imagery, different language, but these overlap and essentially tell the same story. Now, we've walked through the seals, we've walked through the trumpets, and there's kind of an interlude in the middle of the book here around chapters 12, 13, and 14, where John unfortunately receives some of the most graphic, honestly grotesque visions that Jesus gives him. And we're left a little bit to wonder how the guy handled it. Like, honestly, he's in his mid-80s. He's on a prison island in exile. And these are graphic, like the good visions. The vision of the risen, reigning Jesus that John gets in chapter 1 leaves him lying down as if dead. That's the good vision. I don't know how his ancient ticker handled it, honestly. These are nightmares that linger with you long after you finished the vision. And I think in part, that's the point of the book. We looked at the first of these graphic images last week. The picture of a cosmic spiritual battle, of an ancient conflict that began back in Genesis chapter 3 between Eve and between the serpent now portrayed as a dragon, and there's a woman who's pregnant about to give birth, and this dragon is hovering over top of this pregnant woman waiting to devour the child that's born. Can I let you in on a secret? You will not find a Christmas Hallmark card anywhere that uses this image. But in part, this is exactly the picture that John has in mind. He says, take a look at the spiritual reality, at the conflict being waged that surrounds even the birth of Jesus. In fact, friends, I will suggest to you, speaking of images I don't want to explain away, when you open Christmas cards this year and you are confronted with a nice, peaceful, nostalgic nativity scene, I want you to see the shadow of the dragon. I want you to see that lurking above this town of Bethlehem. I want you to see that in the stalls of the manger. I want you to see that over top. That's the point. John says there's more going on than meets the eye. And the baby is born, the child is born, and the dragon goes after the child, but he swings and he misses. This is the victory through an apparent defeat. We have the life, the ministry, the ascension of Jesus summed up in about 2 sentences. And was snatched up to heaven. And in a fit of rage, the dragon turns his attention to the woman. And we want to go, wait, he goes after Mary? No, there's overlapping pictures here. Eve, Mary, the people of God. The dragon hates Jesus. He missed Jesus. But in a fit of rage, he can go after Jesus' followers. And we come to these middle chapters, and friends, I want to suggest they wrestle with the question, why is it so hard for followers of Jesus to overcome? Why is it so hard for us to remain loyal, to conquer? And in part, the answer is because you and I have the dragon's attention. And he is bent on keeping us and doing anything in his power to keep us from all-out obedience. And that drops us off here, if you will, at Revelation chapter 13, where we are this week. I want to suggest to you, and I'll hat tip later on some that will read this differently, but I believe in many respects this is not a chronological sequence. We're going to back up, and we're going to see an overlapping picture of what we saw last week. It's going to build on it. It's going to add some new pieces. But it's another picture that we need to see in the art gallery, if you will, of Revelation that helps us as Jesus followers answer that question, why is it so hard to remain faithful to him? You ready? I'm going to read the first half. We'll talk a little bit about it. I'll read the second half. We'll do the same thing there. And the dragon stood on the shore of the sea. And I saw a beast coming out of the sea. He had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on his horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear, and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was astonished and followed the beast. Men worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshipped the beast and asked, who is like the beast? Who can make war against him? The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise his authority for 42 months. He opened his mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. He was given power to make war against the saints and to conquer them. And he was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the book of life belonging to the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. He who has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to go into captivity he will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword, he will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. The dragon goes after followers of Jesus. He doesn't go after them directly. He goes after them through 2 henchmen, if you will. A beast from the sea, and as we're about to pick up, a beast from the earth. The dragon and the 2 beasts, it's been kind of almost jokingly said in this case, but I think there's truth in this. There's a mimicking. It's almost like we have an unholy trinity here. The dragon, the beast from the sea, the beast from the earth. In the same way that the Father gives authority to his Son, we find the dragon offering authority to the beast from the sea. In the same way that the Holy Spirit points and encourages the worship of the Son, we're about to discover the beast from the earth is going to point and encourage the worship of another. I think the Old Testament text that best helps us wrestle with this particular image and try to understand it better comes from Daniel chapter 7, and I'm not going to read it, I'm simply going to reference it here. Daniel has a section that's also we would call apocalyptic literature, dreams and visions that he records. One of these is in chapter 7, and it's a dream. Daniel writes it down. In his dream, he sees 4 different beasts come out of the sea, and you can see John borrowing from that language here. In Daniel's dream, the first one I want to say is like a lion, the second is like a bear, the third is like a leopard, and the fourth, he says, is indescribable. But as we keep reading through the book of Daniel, there's a pretty specific explanation offered. He says these 4 beasts are world powers. They're nations that have moved out from under the rule and the reign of God. And as a result, it's maybe corny to say it this way, but they've become beastly, if you will. There's mimicking. There's spiritual parody being offered here. There's a head. There appears to be a fatal wound. It feels like does it come back to life? Is there a resurrection story that's being hinted at in and around here? There's probably a little bit of history, by the way, in the first century that helps us understand this. Probably that John's first century readers would have seen in the text. At the age of 32, the Roman Emperor Nero, one of Rome's most brutal and horrible emperors, committed suicide. But a rumor started to spread that he wasn't actually dead, but that he'd been removed, that he'd been taken to a remote island, that he was recovering, and that he was going to return to take his throne back again. Now, Nero did die. He wasn't resuscitated. But the rumor took on mythic proportions so that Nero impersonators started to rise up around the empire, and some of them were able to win significant followings. That's the kind of nature that this rumor had and that it took on even in this period of time. We're going to continue reading in a minute. I just want to point out, John actually doesn't say here that the head comes back to life, but rather that the beast does. And much in the same way that in Daniel's vision, the beasts usually refer to world powers, empires, kingdoms, political entities, like however you want to kind of describe that. Head probably refers to ruler. What happens when a ruler dies? The kingdom goes into turmoil. But oftentimes the kingdom is revived. Takes a while. Sometimes it takes the leadership of another, but the kingdom comes back. If we skipped ahead to Revelation 17, I at least need to acknowledge that this morning. We've been trying to move through Revelation just kind of chapter by chapter. Revelation 17 offers some commentary on these verses, so I need to acknowledge that. The symbolism that we find there strongly hints that John's first century audience would have seen this picture and understood that the empire being talked about is that of Rome. Right? In Daniel's day, the beast was Babylon. But that would be followed by Persia, that would be followed by Greece, and here in the first century, this would be understood to be Rome. The question is this only Rome? I've just referenced this like really quickly. Daniel's dream, you have kind of like one like a lion, one like a bear, one like a leopard, and you'll notice the beast here that John talks about has a weird combination of all of these parts somehow together, right? Does that mean it's the fourth? Or is that indicative of something else? And I'll simply offer this as a suggestion. Friends, we know that until Jesus returns, our world will not see the end of empires and kingdoms that move out from under the rule and the reign of God. And as nation and as kingdoms continue to do this, it will take a new face and it will look new, but it will have the same hints and trappings that have been true of other generations and of other empires. Nazism becomes communism, becomes nationalism. Nationalism is fairly positive and upbeat, right? But does it glorify and worship God, or does it glorify and worship self? Leopard, lion, bear. And I think this is the pattern that we see over and over and over again, at least until Jesus returns. Let's finish our chapter here. Then I saw another beast coming out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb. There's mimicking again. But he spoke like a dragon. He exercised all the authority of the first beast on his behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. It's the beast that's healed. And he performed great and miraculous signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to earth in full view of men. Because of the signs he was given power to do on behalf of the first beast, he deceived the inhabitants of the earth. He ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. He was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast so that it could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. He also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. This calls for wisdom. If anyone has insight, let him calculate the number of the beast, for it is man's number. His number is 666. It's kind of an appropriate Halloween kind of a text, isn't it? Like, we didn't plan it that way, but it kind of feels that way. If the beast from the sea is probably best understood as political power that has moved out from under the rule and the reign of God, who or what is the beast from the earth? And we simply go, so what role does he play? He encourages the worship of the other. In fact, there are religious overtones and undertones kind of sprinkled throughout this whole section. If we jump to Revelation 17, you'll discover this beast is referred to as the false prophet. Jesus says false Christs, messiahs, and prophets are going to come in an attempt to deceive. He says, watch out for that. And if the first beast seems best interpreted or understood as political powers that no longer honor God, it would make sense for us to conclude that this second one actually is spiritual or religious power. Institutions, organizations, individuals that have also moved out from under the rule and the reign of God. And that's a sobering, unseen reality of the present. It's one thing for us to say, you know what, governments can make it difficult for us to follow Jesus. But it's a sobering reality to say there can be spiritually based or religious organizations that make it hard for Jesus' followers to be faithful and loyal. Again, there's spiritual mimicking, counterfeiting, if you will. In the first section, there's a parody on the resurrection. In this case, it's miracles that feel like they're being done. We would properly ask, are these legit? Like, are they legit miracles? Are they fabricated? I think both are possible, quite honestly. If we read our Exodus story at face value, as God starts to send the plagues, we discover Pharaoh's magicians are capable of reproducing at least some of the first ones. If there is spiritual power in the universe, good and evil, it's not surprising that these could be legit. I'm just going to be honest about that. Having said that, there's historical evidence as well that already by the first century, pagan priests were finding creative ways, magic tricks, contraptions, etc., to make it look like statues could move or could speak, or that thunder and lightning were coming from them. Some of the emperors of that day would borrow some of these because you could give a speech and make it look like you were Zeus, right? Like it's like, and this was very good politically. You can understand why. Are they real? Are they fabricated? You know what? It doesn't matter. The point is that a counterfeit gospel is being offered. That's the point. People are being deceived into worshiping someone or something other than the living God. The second beast also demands wholehearted allegiance. This loyalty is identified with a mark placed on people, the infamous mark. Literal mark? Many think so. I'll say this. We discover marks on people, symbols, seals, names, in several places throughout this book. This is the only place that people want to say is literal. All the other ones are symbolic. If I was going to offer a clue that at least leads me to lean in a direction, if I can say it that way, this whole chapter is one of counterfeiting what Jesus is doing. Back in chapter 7, if you remember, we find a picture of the people of God. Nations, tribes, it's summed up in 144,000. Jesus sends an angel to place a mark on the forehead. If we jump ahead, if you're in your Bibles, you can look at the first few verses of Revelation 14. It's going to read back into there. It's going to say the mark on the forehead of Jesus' followers is his name and or the name of his Father. Literal tattoo? That's not what we lean towards. And if this chapter is mimicking and parodying, we probably should be hesitant to assume that the mark of the beast is literal too. Having said that, that doesn't mean it's not real. Don't misunderstand me. Just because I don't think it's a tattoo doesn't mean it's not real. What is the name of Jesus marked on his followers? It's the character of Jesus, the character and the way of the Lamb, imprinted on us and in us by the power and the presence of his Holy Spirit. It means when people look at us, they can see to whom we belong. Why? Because we have a tattoo on our forehead? No, because of the way we live. This is also true on the converse. There are those who follow the beast. Can you tell them because of the hideous tattoos they have? Probably not. Doesn't seem to be the driving point. You can see it because it's obvious by the way that they live. So I'll suggest to you, I don't think this mark is a tattoo. I don't think it's a barcode. I doubt it's a microchip under the skin. It is the character of someone imprinted on the heart that's lived out in life, which of course does bring us to the number 666. What is this? Why does John use it? Boy, if you read on this subject, there's not a shortage of speculation, and the breadth is wide. I'm going to offer two suggestions to you this morning that I think are both the most commonly held and probably the most credible. That's not to say they're the only ones. And if you pushed me on the subject, I'd say I think there might be some truth in both of these. And the first involves something called gematria. And if you haven't heard of that word, that's fine. This is the use of numbers to spell words. So in the first century AD, they don't have numerals like we do today, 1, 2, 3, 4. So if you want to use numbers, you substitute letters for them. So bear with me, I'll just use this as an analogy. If we did this with English, A would be 1, B would be 2 until we get to 10, which is J, and at that point we would move by tens. So J is a 10, K is a 20, until we get to 100, which is S, and then we go by hundreds. So S is 100, T is 200, and so on. So again, for the sake of analogy, I calculated the number of my name, Andrew. It equals 650. I won't lie, I was doing the math this week and saw it climb up into the mid 600s, and I was getting really worried. I was like, oh my word. Whew. Was about to not use that as an example, but we just short here. Here's the problem with this. The problem is this: it is really easy to turn a name into a number. It is really hard to turn a number into a name because the possibilities are almost endless. You have no key that solves the puzzle. And so what people do is they find a name that they want to make fit, and they'll use it in Greek. And if that doesn't fit, they'll translate it into Hebrew. A lot of the audience would have been Jewish. There's history for that. If it doesn't calculate in Hebrew, maybe we'll try Latin, which was a fairly significant translation of the Bible at one point. And if that still doesn't work, then what people start doing is they add titles and names. So if Andrew doesn't add up to 650, but you need it to be 666, maybe Pastor K does. Or maybe Andrew in Low German. Everything's a little bit longer in Low German, right? And so again, I know, this is the problem, is you can make it say anything you want. Now, the reason I still think there's some credibility to this is if you take in the Greek language Neron Kaiser. Now, we already referenced Nero as one of the most brutal, beastly emperors of the first century. If you take Neron Kaiser, which is like kind of just literally Nero Caesar, we've added a title, as you can see, and then you translate it to Hebrew, which I won't bother doing for you, so you have to go through that hoop as well. It does equal 666. So is it possible that for John's audience, this is what would be something that they would make reference to, or a connection with? And I suspect that's possible. John's audience likely understands this beast as referring to the world empire of that day, which would be Rome. It would be not impossible for them to draw a specific comparison to an emperor there as well. I don't think we need to go there. I'm inclined, and you already know this from the way we've walked through other stuff, I think the number might just be symbolic. It says, if anyone has insight, let him calculate the number of the beast, for it is man's number. In this case, I think the NIV actually does a really good job of translating the original Greek language. There's no article in front of the word man. It does not say, let him calculate the number of a man or of an individual. It says, it is man's number, anthropos. It's a human number. I think it's an analogy. John has woven sevens into the fabric of this entire book, everywhere. 7, if you recall, is a number of completeness or of perfection. If you wanted to numerically tell a story of incompleteness, of the best that humanity can offer while still falling short. In fact, by the way, who or what was created on day 6 of creation? Human. This would be a really wonderful way of numerically describing incompleteness. Why 3? And again, we've had this conversation in several spots. This would be a Jewish way of saying something in an ultimate way. Good, better, best. Holy, holy, holy. I mean, God's holy or he's not. No, it's a Jewish way of saying something in an ultimate way. If you want to say something in the ultimate way numerically, we were back in chapter 7. We said 144,000, 12 tribes of Israel, 12 disciples of Jesus, 12 times 12, 144, times 10, times 10, times 10. It's a Jewish way of saying something in the ultimate way. If you wanted a numerical picture of ultimate incompleteness, of falling horribly short, this would be a Jewish way of saying that. Which also means it could refer to Nero. And even if it does, he becomes simply a type of others who will follow. And it invites you and it invites me to be aware of that and watching for those. Each week I feel like we don't have time to talk about everything that might be interesting, that we might like to. In this case, I would anticipate some saying, it says he has power for 42 months. You haven't talked about that. That's fair. Here's what I want to do starting this week. I'd love to try to be open-handed with the series. We have to, time constraints just limit what we can and can't address. And I won't lie to you, there's information speculated on this book that Revelation has the kind of material written on it like chess theory, and you think, oh, it's a game. And then you start to, there's reams of literature on an opening move, and this book has the same. Anyway, If you are curious about stuff, you have a question about things we've talked about, you have a question about things we haven't talked about. We didn't talk about the two witnesses back in chapter 11. If that interests you, all I'm going to say is send us your questions. At this point, I'll just say email. My email is andrew@westportalchurch.ca. You can send it to our main office at westportalchurch.ca. It'll come across our desks. And what we'll wrestle to do over the coming weeks is we'll put together just some short video answers, 2 to 3 minutes, at least as a way of continuing the conversation and staying kind of engaged with this in some of the rabbit trail places that we haven't had a chance to go to. And so if that's helpful to you, feel free to reach out. Here's a hat tip this morning. Not everybody will read this particular chapter the way I have and the way I've chosen to this morning. This is a fairly common way. The other is there are those who will read this and say that the beast from the sea refers, nobody argues that the dragon is probably Satan. Everybody pretty much nods their head and goes, yeah, that sounds about right. But there are those who would say that the beast from the sea is not just world powers that continue to come until Jesus returns. It's the last one, which means we're talking about the last Antichrist leader that will come on the world scene. And so that's possible. Of course, if you're going to interpret that beast as an individual, you will also interpret the second beast as an individual. The false prophet then becomes an individual. Nobody really knows who that is, which is fine. We just accept that he'll be on the world scene at the same time and would be there to prop up and encourage the leadership of the other. Is it possible these are individuals? Of course it is. I would say there are two things that are absolutely true, and regardless of how you land, you believe this. Until Jesus returns, the world has not seen its end of Antichrist rulers and empires in this world. And if there is an end, and I believe there is, there will be a last one. There will be a final one. And the trajectory of the book of Revelation hints it's going to get really bad. That's just kind of the way it goes. So could it be? Could this be specifically talking about that? It could. I'll tell you the reason why I don't really want to lean in this direction. Mark chapter 13, Jesus is talking a little bit about some of the signs, some indications that his return isn't that far away. These have been true of every generation since Jesus was here. But nonetheless, one of the things Jesus says is, nobody knows the day or the hour. Nobody knows when I'm coming back. But you know what this also implicitly means? Satan doesn't know who the last Antichrist is either. He can't, by sheer definition. And so he has to have antichrists available and ready in every generation. Satan will only know who the last one is because Jesus shows up. Oh, and he knows his time is officially short. If Revelation 13 is about decoding who the last guy is, with great respect, do you know who reads this chapter and reads prophetic speculative literature with more enthusiasm than we do? Yeah. Just saying. And the reason in particular that I lean in the other direction is I think if we spend our time trying to decode this as the guy, we miss the point, which is be aware of the counterfeit tendencies and temptations that are going to be true in your culture and in your world. And that's kind of why I lean in this direction. Listen, we need to move a little bit towards application this morning. One of the things I said in the outset was, I feel like I don't want to explain the picture away. We need the picture. And I feel like I want to somehow picture this hanging like on a wall, and it's got these beasts, and they're hideous, and it's grotesque. And I'm like, the last thing in my heart is to worship any of these things. But you know how in art galleries, sometimes there's like a small caption underneath the picture, and it's like 2 sentences long, and you're like, oh, and it just, everything clicks for you at that moment? If I could put a caption under the portrait that is Revelation 13 and all of its grotesque, horrible nature, I would take Jesus' words from Mark chapter 13 that say this: if at that time anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform signs and miracles to deceive the elect, if that were possible. And then he says, so be on your guard. That's the punchline for me. Not anticipate who the last one is. Be on your guard now for those places where this is true in our world today. Let me give you 2 really short ideas for application. The first is this. Friends, and it all boils down to worship here. Who gets your and my primary allegiance? Why is it so hard for followers of Jesus to overcome and to conquer? Because we have somebody's attention, And he's bent on distracting us and keeping us from all-out obedience. Two thoughts. First is this: true worship will always point people to Jesus. So disclaimer, I'm not opposed to exuberant, joyful, charismatic worship, although we tend to be a little more conservative here in our faith tradition. I also happen to believe that Jesus still does miracles in this world today. It's not the norm, but I believe it happens. Sometimes in the lives of his followers, sometimes through the prayer and the influence of his followers. The true test of the gospel message will never be, is it fun? Is it exciting? Is it sensational? It might be. It really might. But the true test of the gospel is always going to be, does it humbly point people to Jesus? Because if it doesn't, if it is pointing people elsewhere or inwards, wherever it happens to be, it is by default a false prophet and antichrist. And it says this calls for wisdom on the part of you and me to be watching for this. Now, the other piece I would maybe just say in closing is this: if the mark of the beast is symbolic, like all the other marks in Revelation, and I think that's probably the case here, I suspect John tells us about it not so much to satisfy our end times curiosity as he does to warn us about the dangers of compromise. In the first century, Roman citizens were required to go to the temple and you had to offer a pinch of incense. You had to worship the emperor. It was a small thing, but it was kind of a big deal. Now, if you're a follower of Jesus, this is an obvious compromise, right? Honor Caesar as emperor, I can do that. Worship him as Lord, that's problematic. There are obvious areas of compromise. In and around the first century and kind of to follow, it wasn't unusual for coinage to have the face of the emperor on it. Again, this isn't uncommon. We have leaders on the face of our coins as well today. But it was accompanied with a caption that didn't say something like, "In God we trust." It said, "Son of God." So here's a question for you. Do you use coinage that declares Caesar to be God? Well, I'm just saying it's not as obvious anymore. Can I use this and say I don't believe it, but I'll use, right? In every culture, there's obvious temptation to compromise, and then there are subtle, less obvious temptations to compromise. And I think this passage, amongst many others, in a graphic way, warns us to be watching for those. In fact, I found myself thinking this past week, you know how like different shows or things have like rating systems, 3 out of 5 stars or whatever? I found myself thinking, what if Jesus actually let us peek behind the curtain of the activities and the mundane things that we fill our lives and distract ourselves with what I'd call a beast meter? What if when you queue up Netflix to watch your show, before your show comes on, there's a little rating at the bottom that says 3 out of 5 beast meter? That's the level this is encouraging you to compromise. Right? Would you still watch it? Spotify playlist. Oh, this song is a 1 out of 5 beast meter. Can we celebrate that? Or do we have to say no? And this would be true of what we spend our money on. This would be true of the activities we find ourselves in the midst of. It'll be true of the joking conversations in the lunchroom and table. I'm just saying it permeates every facet of our lives. And I feel like that's the thrust, the point of Revelation 13. There's no room for divided loyalty. And you and I are faced on a daily basis with temptation to compromise our allegiance and our loyalty to Jesus. And friends, this is the question I leave you with. Who will you and I worship? Bad news. It will not be answered by what you say or what we sing on Sunday morning. It will be answered by the way we live in the days and the weeks that follow. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you. First of all, for your great love for your creation, your sinful, rebellious creation that thumbed their noses at you, walked away, and you walked towards us instead. Thank you for walking to the cross, for the victory that came through an apparent defeat, that the way you conquered was the way of sacrificial love. Your justice is coming. It has to, or you wouldn't be good and you wouldn't be holy. It judges those who live in opposition, but it purifies. It invites your followers to clarify who we really belong to. Thank you for your presence that walks with us in the ups and downs of life, in the struggles, in the suffering, in the difficult choices. Give us strength in those places where we are perhaps waning with energy. Encourage and strengthen faith. Inspire us towards greater levels of sold-out obedience to you. Give hope. Strengthen us for the journey that you have invited us to walk. By faith we walk. One day this journey will be finished. Until that time we find ourselves living the story that has been lived out by saints in every generation. What does it mean to live the way of the Lamb? We love you. We trust that you are able to do that work in our hearts and in our lives. Strengthen us to that end, and may we support and encourage each other well to that end so that your story can be told in this world and your kingdom can continue to press in. And so I invite you, let's close with prayer together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. God bless.